This is Duke University.
I told myself when I finished my last book that under no circumstances was I going to write another book, unless the book came at me that just had to be written. And so this really is what happened here. It was the coincidence of a set of case study materials that I never expected to get hold of, and interviews I did and so forth that I didn't plan to do, and then a data set that fell in my lap that, well, with a lot of effort, fell in my lap. And these things had to be put together, and it seemed that there was a bigger story to be told. But this book actually has already been censored twice by the IMF. So I'm going for a third time. Okay, so this is the outline of the book, which you have. The first part sets the context. So I introduce a general theory of international organization, which is based, in a nutshell, on the notion of informal governance, by which I mean that governance of international organizations in general, I'm going to argue, runs along two tracks. One is a formal track, which is the one that we tend to generally focus attention on as institutionalists, and the other is the informal track, which the realists used to pay a lot of attention to. Though they tended to also dismiss the institutions. They didn't pursue this as far as they could have. But the notion is that the informal track provides an opportunity for very powerful states to exercise exceptional control under special circumstances. So this data that I was talking about, this is from the IMF's own records of conditionality, which are rather disorganized. It's kind of shocking, actually. When you dig into them, it's very difficult to figure out what was going on. But with a lot of effort, you can extract from this some data that are actually quite useful for analysis. There are a lot of countries, a lot of them are borrowers, and then I've got 11 years worth of data. What's special about these data, for one thing, I can say something substantive about the conditionality. I don't just have measures of the number of conditions applied. I have 19 categories of conditions, so I know what kinds of structural conditions were being applied in which cases, and when in the program they were being tested, and what kinds of macroeconomic conditions were imposed, and so forth. There's a formal procedure under which the managing director of the IMF has a tremendous amount of power. They get to make the proposal. And the proposal always passes. All right. Now, of course, there's an important distinction to be made between policy issues and country issues. In a policy issue, things are much more freewheeling and much more democratic on the board, and the discussions are much more interesting. But when we're talking about individual countries, the parameters of the program have already been negotiated before it comes to the board. It's not practical to amend it. Right? And it would be very costly to reject it. Right? So in effect, it gets passed. Right? So the managing director has tremendous amount of power because it's able to set the agenda. Now you have a weighted system of voting, which in principle should be reflected in the outcomes. Right? Everybody's represented in the sense that if you have enough shares, you get to nominate your own executive director, and if you don't, then you're part of somebody else's coalition. Right? So you're represented through somebody. For example, Iran and Pakistan, or Pakistan is represented by Iran in the IMF Executive Board. That's kind of interesting. And then the notion is that there's supposed to be corporate oversight by the Executive Board. It's supposed to at least execute ex post accountability over the managing director. But in fact, things work quite differently. So in fact, when it wants to, the United States exercises agenda control. And what you just have to get to the managing director first and tell him what you want him to submit, and he does. All right, so informal participation makes all the difference here. This is an institution which makes it really easy for the United States to exercise an override when it wants to. And very non-transparent. Right? So it's kind of difficult to figure out ex post when it's happened. So turning this around, since the three measures of vulnerability have the same sort of qualitative effects, it's convenient to summarize this by adding them up. And the other thing I interacted USAID with was capacity of the government. The idea being that countries that have a lot of state capacity should be able to negotiate with the United States on more equal terms, right, than countries that have very weak state capacity. So you ought to see less of an effect of bargaining over conditionality if the country has a weak state. And concretely, this suggests that countries with weak states that aid given to countries of weak states has a different substantive meaning. So in particular, we can talk about, I like to call it the varieties of international organizations. So we've got two measures of, so two exogenous variables in the model. One is the long-term conflict of interest, right, which is this parameter of the temptation. How often do we expect overriding is going to happen? And the other is the dispersion of structural power, which is the number of leading states in the system. Right, so the IMF, it turns out, is kind of a special case over here in the corner, where you really have only one effective leading state, and there's very little long-term conflict of interest. Now, there's a lot of disagreement about when to make exceptions to the rules, but the main powers in the system all agree that it would be a good thing for other countries to reform themselves and reduce their trade barriers and follow sensible macroeconomic policies. Right? They all agree about that. So there isn't a whole lot of long-term conflict of interest. The conflict of interest is short-term.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.